All right, BookTube family, Sandy Goldin back here, getting ready to do my wrap-up video for not 1, but 2 months. So you get a bonus month here. Although I'm gonna whip through them kind of fast, I am going to wrap up the books that I read in July and August of 2021. That's coming up next. So first up, going back to the month of July, I'm going to start with one of my favorite authors who dropped his book in the month of June, and I finally got around to reading it in very early July, and that is Survive the Night by Riley Sager. I did a video talking about this book earlier. I really did like this book. I didn't love it as much as some other Riley Sager books, but it was a solid read, and now that I've had about, I don't know, almost 2 months to digest it, it's kind of crept up a little bit higher for me, but not hit my favorite Riley Sager book, but it was a solid read, and I look forward to the next Riley Sager book, which I believe he just announced the title recently, and Riley Sager remains an auto-buy for me. Next up is The Poet X by Elizabeth Acevado, and this was a book that I read as an ebook, and I really enjoyed it. I was really excited about the story because a lot of the things that go on in modern school and young adult settings that I thought were kind of interesting, so as I started to read that, and I think about my affinity for young adult type stories and stories that are set in school settings or college settings, so K through 12 or college settings, boarding school, traditional school, this was a book that I thought was really interesting. Now, one of the challenges of this book for me was that it was written in verse, so with the kind of poetry type of style, it made it a little bit challenging, but I think the fact that I listened to it as an audiobook really helped me to digest it better. But then again, the more I think about it, I'm like, maybe if I'd read it, it might have maybe had even a bigger impact. So I might, if I can find the book as a physical book, I might actually pick it up and give it another try. But it was a very enjoyable read, a very powerful story. If you can work through the verse and that doesn't bother you too much, this is going to be a good read for you. Next up is The Hating Game by Sally Thorne, and this is I don't know, maybe your classic enemies to lovers story, and it has to do with two employees who are working in the same office, and they're up for a promotion together, and so you can imagine the tension that's going on as they are battling and competing, and they don't just dislike each other, as the book description says, they actually hate each other, downright hate each other. So I had always wanted to read an enemies to lovers type story, just to see, if for no other reason, if it's a story type that I want to venture into at some point, because I've never done an enemies to lovers story. But this was a good one. I did it as an audiobook, and it was pretty enjoyable, although I think it's one that I'd probably rather have read the physical copy a little bit more. Maybe it would have soaked in a little bit better for me, but it was a really cool story, a fun story to read, and it gave me kind of an entryway into the enemies to lover type story. So I might try a few more of those in the not too distant future. Next up, I read The Escape Room by Megan Goldin. Now, I had really good success, surprising success with Megan Goldin before. I read The Night Swim, which is in back of me, and that was last year. I got that as a book of the month entry, and I wasn't sure, it wasn't a lot of that was exciting me. When I looked at it, I was kind of like lukewarm about it when I got it, but then when I got it home and I started reading it, and it was in that podcast type of storytelling format, I just absolutely loved it. Very difficult topic, but very interesting topic at the same time. So The Escape Room is very interesting. It's another thriller type of a story, and it's a team building exercise that turns into something way more than what you're expecting from your classic, office team building exercise. So, but I am really becoming a fan of Megan Goldin's writing style, as well as the types of stories that she likes to write. So this was one I was definitely glad I picked up. Again, I did it as an audiobook, and I am glad that I did, because it was a really good read. It was a very fast read, and it definitely it got me a little bit on the edge of my seat, and I actually did it overnight listening to it, so I was pretty much wasted the rest of the next day, but it was worth it for a very good read, The Escape Room by Megan Goldin. Next up is A Good Neighborhood by Therese and Fowler. And this is a book that I've been thinking about this book for a long time in terms of really jumping into it. It has to do with an idyllic neighborhood, a property line, a battle over what can happen on both sides of the property line, and a teenage romance thrown in there with a little bit of a racial angle as well. So maybe more than a little bit, but that's up to you to read it and find out. But I did enjoy this book. It was good. It was a little different than what I was expecting coming into it, but it had some good elements that had me really excited. So I was definitely glad to pick this one up. It ended up being a solid read. Not quite, again, as high as I was hoping for. It was not so much that it wasn't as good as I was hoping for, but it was just a little different than maybe what I was expecting. But it was a good read, and I would definitely read another one again by this author. Next up is Valentine by Elizabeth Wetmore, and this is a book that takes us back to the 1970s, Odessa, Texas, oil. You start thinking about the old TV show Dallas, maybe, if you're of a certain age. But this was a book that was very interesting. It had to do with a horrific crime that takes place, and there are elements of racism, sexism, classism, all kinds of stuff going on in this story. Very powerful story. I did it mostly as an audiobook, and I think I would like to go back and maybe reread it again, focusing more on the physical copy of the book. But it was really a good story, a very powerful story, and I knew it was going to be when I first saw it pop up on my radar. Definitely glad I read this one. Very powerful story, not one to enter very lightly, but one that I think if you consider the 1970s to be historic fiction, I hope not, because I was born in the 1970s, and that would make me historic, but not necessarily fiction. But this was a really good story. Definitely enjoyed this. Valentine. Next up, I read If I Was Your Girl, an award-winning YA transgender love story by Meredith Russo. And this was one that popped up as an audiobook, and I said, well, you know what, I'll give it a try. It's a little something slightly off the beaten path of what I normally read, but I thought it would be kind of interesting to just branch out and to read something different. And it was a very solid story, pretty well told. It's not a very deep story, but I think it's a story that you can really appreciate, because it is a transgender love story, and there is some violence that's in the story, but it's part of the story, I don't think necessarily gratuitous, but it really is kind of a coming of age story. It is young adult, so if you're into young adult, then this might be a story that you might be interested in reading. So take a chance and go off the beaten path, read something a little bit different, and this was a little bit different for me, and I was definitely glad I read it. It was a very fast read, audio read, if you will, and it was one that I can see why it was an award-winning story. It's probably a story that's not being told nearly enough for some people, and that's one of the reasons why I was definitely glad that I picked that one up. Next up was Daisy Jones and the Six by Taylor Jenkins Reid. I have another individual video that you'll see on the channel that I had about this one, actually two, one before I read it and one after I read it, so check those out. I go in a lot more depth about this book. I did really enjoy this book. Another book by Taylor Jenkins Reid that's a good one for me. And lastly, I read The Vines by Shelly Nolden, and this was a book that I was pretty excited about. There's a urban exploration type of story that's being told here. There's a family connection, there's a mysterious woman on a mysterious island, and there's a lot going on there with a kind of an interesting connection that works its way through. It's a little bit of a longer story, and so it's going to maybe test your endurance a little bit, but it's a really interesting story. I was definitely glad I picked it up. It was slightly different than what I was expecting, and definitely it's got a couple storylines that make it at times a little bit hard to follow, but at the same time it was really a good read in terms of the subject matter. For me, fits with a lot of interest. I'm on YouTube and I like to watch urban explorer videos, so this one was really good for me to pick up, and apparently the algorithms on Facebook kept believing that too, because they kept delivering this book to me, and eventually I guess advertising does work, because I did buy this particular book. It is a very good read. It's actually the physical copy of this book is very good. It's on very high quality paper. It's a very attractive cover, very heavy book, very good, and definitely glad I read it. The Vines by Shelly Nolden. So that wraps up the last 2 months of reading for me. It was pretty fun last 2 months. I was able to break out of my reading slump a little bit, which is a good thing, and it put me on a pretty good track to begin the month of September.